Hi, I'm recording this as the President of Churches and Communities, and I'm joined by my Vice President, Bishop Noel McLean. So, Noel, we really felt on our hearts that we needed to come together and have a conversation about what's happening in the country in the light of the death of George Floyd out there in America. So what kind of issues have been coming in your direction as a church leader here in the UK since that tragedy out in Minneapolis?
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. I think the issues have been both specific and accumulative. So the sense of injustice, the sense of anger, outrage, shock, has been difficult for us as a group of people that can identify with historic and systemic injustice and racism. So what makes it difficult to articulate, and maybe difficult for some people to understand, that it is very much accumulative. And the kind of conversations I've been having with leaders as well as congregants is the sense of we've had enough. There is a weariness now that is so apparent that, I think that the crescendo is we want to see change, and we want to have conversations where it's not simply that we're heard, but I think essentially, Hugh, that our feelings are felt.
I really appreciate that, Noel. I think that's a great way of putting it. It's got to get to the stage where people are feeling other people's feelings, not just listening to other people's arguments. And that's a really, really good way of putting it. I must admit, this whole thing has been incredibly painful to me. I was only out in Minneapolis a year or so back ministering to some of the Black congregations there, and had an absolutely amazing time. And it just breaks my heart. I've been in touch with them during all of this, but it's become so widespread. It's affecting just so many people. And somehow it was that cry of, I can't breathe. I know that there was a cry about a physical situation that was actually cutting off his life, but I can't breathe is such an incredibly powerful statement. It's like, people have just had enough of being restricted. And I can think of restrictions. I mean, within churches and communities, we come up against restrictions where we may be putting an ethnic minority chaplain in a place, and then we have the whole struggle of getting that ethnic minority chaplain properly respected. We have situations where people have had to change their name because people won't even bring them to an interview if they've got an African sounding name. So some of these things, I just feel the pain of it. And I understand what you mean about it being cumulative. What do you think we should be doing?
Well, I think in a way here, you've touched on it. I think it's identifying, particularly for us in the UK as church leaders, that we are not exempt. We are not innocent. But I think the first thing is to recognize, and this may be challenging for some people to hear, that our attitudes are not only going to be part of the solution, but maybe whether it's consciously or unconsciously, we've been part of the problem. I mean, you've just highlighted a systemic issue. So I think the first point needs to be a great sense of humility, a time of introspection. We can't divorce ourselves from what has happened 1,000 miles away, because, as you said, it links into so many of our daily experiences. So I think first and foremost, there has to be a sense of introspection. I think secondly, there has to be some kind of clear pathway whereby the people that want to respond and want to make the changes actually understand the issue. And what I mean by that, and again, this may sound controversial, I think there's something about Hebrews 4:15 which talks about Jesus not being a high priest that cannot be touched with the feelings or infirmities. We need people who are actually in touch, not people who are distanced, but yet are in roles of responsibility. We need to look at those that are around the decision-making process, those that are in places of authority, and if they're not in touch, bring in people who actually are, people that are not just going to simply be theorizing and sometimes conflating an issue, but people who can actually bring anecdotes, people who can actually say, look, these are the issues at grassroots, these are the issues in the church, these are the kind of social issues that we face in the guise of inclusivity, which really is racism. And I think thirdly, and by no means least, a real overwhelming sense of prayer. You know, a real overwhelming sense of, Lord, you know, we've heard the cry of a man that was dying. Now, where is the cry of those that are living? And I think that if there is an overwhelming sense of cry, Lord Jesus, help us. And not in a sense that we know what to do. I love the whole Jehoshaphat prayer. Lord, we don't know what to do, but we're looking to you. And I think if that could be a kind of universal cry, I think that would go some way, a major step forward in trying to tackle this problem head on.
It's interesting that you've sort of picked up on prayer. I think one of the challenges I've had in the past is that some of my friends get dismissed simply as, well, why don't you go away and pray about it? You know, you guys know how to pray, you go and pray, while we do nothing. So I really feel this whole question of identification and coming together, I really want churches and communities to stand together at this time. We're incredibly diverse, and yet, you know, we should be able to, in a sense, stand in each other's shoes. I mean, I've tried doing this for 50 years now. It's probably 50 years since Barry and I were accepted as missionaries to go out to Africa. And we had it hammered into us then that just as a time as colonialism was ending, the last thing African countries needed were a couple of white people turning up thinking that they knew best. And I've had to sort of come away from that. And one of the big things I've learned is don't try and act cross-culturally. You know, that's like keeping one foot in one world and one foot in another. You've got to immerse yourself. But I make mistakes, Noel. I really do. There are times when I think I'm being understanding of another culture, and I'll say something that just isn't appropriate. And, you know, I've sat in situations where I've made a joke and then seen all my friends just go quiet on me, and I think, oh my goodness, I've made a mistake. And what that does do, it puts me in a position where I honestly don't think I know all the answers. So I'm constantly coming to people like yourself and wanting to say, am I getting it right? No. And realizing that there's in fact a multiplicity of ways in which you can get it wrong. You know, in a sense, understanding where the African culture's at as opposed to a Caribbean culture, and then suddenly looking at other cultures as well. There's so much to learn, but coming together with one another is really important. And I can see coming together in prayer and that sense of being self-critical is really important too, I think.
I totally agree, Hugh. And I think that there is a distinct difference between someone that intentionally says, I want to understand, and someone who says, I don't want to understand. I think that sometimes what has hurt, you know, the community I'm from, the Black community, is that so much of the rhetoric that comes out is so generalized and it's not specific. I think one of the things that I've seen in your life and essentially in CiC is that we do make what we do inclusive. We, you know, everyone's voice matters, you know, and I think that is the crucial thing, that, you know, we may speak as one voice, but specific voices matter. You know, when issues have transpired in Nigeria, you know, as CiC leadership, we've been able to speak into that because that particular voice matters. And I think that what we want to do, wouldn't it be amazing if some of the things that we have been trying to model over, you know, a couple of decades could be replicated on a bigger scale? That what we're saying is that this is not just a Black issue, but it's a human issue. But in the same time, in understanding that it's a human issue, we cannot disregard how specific and targeted the racism is. And I just would love to just see that we can, in moving forward, just bring about that sense that, look, your voice is important, your feelings are important, and your specific voice is important. You know, I love the fact that, you know, Deuteronomy 32 talks about God being a God of justice, you know, a God that dislikes injustice. But if we don't have a faith that has mechanisms for speaking out against injustice, then I think we're doing a disservice to the people that we lead.
I think that's really powerful. I think back to 97, when you and I sat down and started discussing setting up churches in communities. And the big thing that was on our hearts then was that we just needed to make room for people. We needed to facilitate people's ministries. God seemed to be raising up people with vision and passion. And it was as if God was saying to us, look, you know, give these people space, give them opportunity. And I think that's just so important. But, you know, it's great to have an organization that longs to do that. But when we're in a society that doesn't actually respond to that, and sees some people's ministries as being more valid than someone else's ministry, and sometimes that comes down to race, sometimes it comes down to gender, and really our heart within CiC is to try and bulldoze away those kind of barriers and say, no, this is about giving everyone the opportunity to be who they are. And when I hear that cry, I can't breathe, it really resonates with me. I can almost like hear some pastors saying, I can't breathe. I can't breathe in my local churches together context because I don't seem to fit. I can't breathe in my chaplaincy context because I don't seem to fit. And I think it's just so incumbent upon us to get hold of this and say, we've got to do something about this. It's not just about being introspective and saying, gosh, where am I getting it wrong? It's now a case of saying, what am I going to do to put it right?
Yeah.
And not just being hearers of the word, but doers and getting out there and doing something. So,
you're right, Hugh. I think that the difficulty is that there's a difference between creating another forum and creating a strategic group. And I think that, if I'm being honest with, you know, within our community, we're almost tired of talking.
Yeah.
You know, we're tired of sometimes even
analyzed. Here comes another sociologist going to analyze us. No,
that's right. You know, I think that the outcomes have to lead to change, and that's why I think that if we can take some of the legitimate momentum that is gathering and find, you know, appropriate ways to respond. And it might even be, you know, writing to our MPs. It might be, you know, engaging and challenging some of the systems in appropriate ways, but there has to be a response. And I think that, you know, doing this interview, I really want to say that, you know, to every one of our CiC members, and because of the specific situation, those that are, you know, are Black leaders, Black ministers, whatever your case may be, that, you know, we do feel your pain. We're not an organization that is divorced from human challenge. We're not divorced from the kind of everyday issues. And I think that even if for those of you who are watching, that is the foundation or the catalyst to inspire you, then I feel that interviews like this would have not been in vain. We don't want it to be something that just placates, but it's something that reassures. You know, Jesus went to the cross in a public way. It wasn't hidden. It was in a public way to demonstrate that he identified with us. And I think that as CiC, as leaders, as human beings, that we're at a point now that we need to find public ways to identify with the people that we are standing with.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that has to be done behind the scenes. I do understand that. There are some committees I'm on where I've decided I am going to push a lot harder than I've done before, because I think that, you know, change happens too slowly. But there are times when, you know, campaigning has its place as well. You just got to get the balance right. My ministry associate's up with Black Lives Matter up in Hyde Park at this moment, and I texted him and said, shout loudly for me. I didn't mean for me, but on my behalf.
Yes,
And I just think that we've got to get this right. It's not just enough to be out there campaigning. There's got to be stuff going on behind the scenes that's actually engaging with the appropriate people and bringing change and knowing how the two fit together. And I think that's really important. But I think you're absolutely right, Noel. It is a time for being out there and saying that these things really, really matter.
Yeah, and I think I just want to pick up on a point you made, Hugh, that I found that the biggest problems in society are multifactorial, which means that as much as we are confident and proud of our Christian influence and what the church can do, we've got to be in co-partnership. And sometimes it's about co-production. You know, I think that the co-production model means that when we're trying to solve a societal issue, we've got to have partners. We need those that are in civic authority to work with us. We need those in the educational system. We need those in the judicial system. So what we're not saying is that we're kind of taking, you know, a kind of dominion attitude that we can do it ourselves, but we can do something.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are passages in the Bible which I really love. And one, there's a little phrase where it refers to a city official that Paul comments on at the end of one of his letters. And I really think that just shows how we've got to engage. We've got to engage with people at every level. So Noel, it's been great to talk to you about this. There's so much more we could say, but I think it's really important that you've been with me to say, look, these things really matter to us. And we do want CiC members to know that we really care about this. And we are fighting your corner, if we can put it that way. Representation and recognition is right up at the top of our agenda. And we want to make sure that we get this right. So bless you. Thank you for looking at this as Noel and I have shared our hearts in this matter. And do get in touch with us if you've got concerns that we can help you with. The CiC office is always there to do its best for you. Every blessing. Thank you, Noel.
Yeah.